Cordite smells like struck matches and burned wire, and a kind of specific permanence. Once you've smelled it, you recognize it in things that have nothing to do with gunfire. Antiseptic smells like someone trying very hard to pretend that what happens in hospitals isn't as close to what happens in war zones as it actually is. I've spent 7 years learning to prefer the antiseptic. I haven't succeeded yet. My name is Mara Voss. I work nights at St. Dominic Medical Center as a staff nurse on the surgical floor. Not trauma, not the ICU, surgical floor, which means post-op recovery and medication management and the kind of work that no one photographs for recruitment posters. I took this job because surgical floor nurses are invisible in the way I needed to be invisible. Nobody asks you questions on the surgical floor. Nobody looks twice at the way you move. And I needed a place where I could be no one in particular for a while, which is a thing you need, sometimes. After you've spent the better part of a decade being someone very specific in places that required it. They thought I was just a floor nurse. Then 4 trucks from the 75th Ranger Regiment pulled into the ambulance bay in the middle of my shift. And a captain with a jaw, like a geological feature, walked into my unit and said he was looking for the medic who went by Rook. And nobody in that corridor knew who he meant, except for me. And I was pressing myself against the wall next to the linen cart, hoping he'd look the other way. He didn't look the other way. Now let me tell you what happened in the hours before he came through that door. The surgical floor at St. Dominic smells like institutional bleach and the faint, warm sweetness of surgical dressings and the particular staleness of a building that recycles its air through filters that haven't been changed since the previous administration. The lights are a dim yellow-white at night, the kind that flattens everyone's face into something slightly unwell. The floors are linoleum, buffed to a shine that squeaks under sneakers and clogs, but goes silent under someone who's learned to walk with weight distribution that doesn't announce itself, which is a habit I've given up trying to break. I started at St. Dominic 14 months ago. I know the layout the way I know the layouts of places I've worked, which means I know it completely. Exits and bottlenecks, and which stairwells lock from the outside and which don't, and which rooms have windows that open and which have been painted permanently shut. This is not information I've gone looking for. I simply accumulate it. You stop noticing that you're doing it around year 3. The patient population on my floor is post-surgical, hips and knees mostly, abdominal cases, the occasional thoracic transfer, elderly in the main. People who have been through something and are now getting through the getting through. I check on them more than my assignment technically requires. Say their names when I walk in. Don't rush. None of this is policy. To the other nurses, the surgical floor at midnight is a long hall. To me, it is a structure I understand. There's a rhythm to it. I know where the rhythm breaks before it breaks. I was in the medication room at the start of my shift when Sandra Briggs, charge nurse, Dr. Gerald Kwan's preferred floor manager, told me I'd been assigned to cover Kwan's service in addition to my own, because the other available nurse had called out. Sandra delivered this the way she delivered most information, as if it were someone else's fault. 6 patients, she said. Kwan's are in rooms 8 through 11. Don't improvise. He has protocols. I'll follow his protocols, I said. She looked at the scar on my neck, below the left ear, down to the collarbone, usually covered but visible tonight because I'd pulled my hair up. People always look at it the same way, calibrating. Where did you train? She said. Johns Hopkins, I said, which is true. I finished the BSN after I got out. It just wasn't the only place I trained. She left. I turned back to the medications. A muscle in my jaw tightened once, and I let it go. Dr. Gerald Kwan arrived at 2100 to do his evening rounds, which was unusual. Most attendings on the surgical floor delegate nights to residents. and the reason he arrived became clear within approximately 45 seconds of his walking through the door. He wanted to be seen. He moved through the unit with the specific performance of a man who understands that he is always being watched and has organized his entire professional identity around this understanding. Tall, athletic, silver at the temples, in the way that reads as distinguished rather than aged, smelling of a cologne I couldn't name but that cost considerably more than it should have. He came to room 9 first. Mr. Alderton, 71, post-hip replacement, 2 days out, was running a low-grade fever and had flagged in my assessment as someone whose surgical site was worth watching. I had noted it, added observations to the chart, and flagged it for physician review at change of shift. Quan read the chart for approximately 4 seconds. This notation. He tapped the screen without looking at me. The wound assessment. The site margins have some early erythema. I flagged it as a precaution. Erythema. He said the word the way you say a word when you want the room to understand that you find it presumptuous. The resident behind him shifted her weight. Is that your clinical determination, nurse? He glanced at my badge, the specific glance that says he already knew and is choosing not to remember. Voss? It's an observation. The call is yours. The call is always mine, he said. He looked at the resident. Can you tell me why a floor nurse's overnight assessment of erythema around a 48-hour post-op site might be within the parameters of expected healing? The resident told him. Correctly. Quan nodded, as if she'd confirmed something he'd been planning to say. He closed the chart and looked at me for the first time as if I were actually present. I don't want flags on my patients' charts that aren't clinically significant. It creates noise. Do you understand what I mean by noise? I do, I said. Good. He moved toward the door, paused, looked back. And next time you feel the need to annotate my patient's records, run it by the charge nurse first. Sandra will tell you whether it rises to the level of clinical significance. He said it loudly enough that the 2 nurses at the station outside the door both looked up. I looked at the floor and counted to 3. Understood, I said. He left. The resident glanced at me, half apology and half something else, recognition maybe. She looked away quickly and followed him out. 48-hour post-op erythema at the surgical site margins with a concurrent low-grade fever is not noise. It is the opening movement of a surgical site infection, and it will announce itself as exactly that within the next 12 hours. I had been right about this kind of thing enough times, in enough different conditions that I stopped needing external confirmation a long time ago. I updated the chart with my full assessment and went to check on my other patients. There's a storage room at the end of the corridor, a window over the east parking lot, a chair someone dragged in and never retrieved, a wall at my back and a sight line to the door. I used it the first few months I worked here. Old habit. I'm not the same person I was in Logar Province in 2015. I am not the person who kept a ranger element alive for 11 hours during a compromised extraction when the medevac window closed and we had to hold until a secondary window opened. Who won a name that night she didn't choose and wore anyway, because names like that get given, not taken back. That person made decisions that I needed 7 years and a nursing degree and 14 months on a surgical floor to be able to live alongside. Most days, I manage it. That night, I was managing it less well than usual. Quan's dismissal sat in my chest like a physical object. Not because of the humiliation, I have metabolized worse, but because Mr. Alderton's site was going to declare itself infected within the next shift. And I had been pushed out of the chain of communication. And someone was going to catch it later than they should. I was going to make sure it got caught on time. I went back to the floor. I swabbed Alderton's wound site myself, labeled it, and walked it to the lab with instructions for an expedited gram stain. Nobody told me to. I did it because it needed doing. Quan returned to the floor at 2300, which nobody was expecting. He had apparently been called back by the overnight resident about a different patient, room 11, a thoracic transfer with a drain output that needed review. He walked past the nursing station with the resident at his elbow, and I heard him, from the end of the corridor, say to Sandra, "Has Voss been in room 9 again?" Sandra said she'd check. I was at the other end of the corridor documenting on a portable terminal, and I said nothing, and I did not look up. Quan appeared at the end of the hall. He looked at me the way powerful people look at problems they have not yet decided how to solve. "I thought I was clear," he said, "about the chart protocols." "The wound culture was a nursing scope action," I said. "It doesn't require physician's sign-off before collection." "In my service, it does." The veteran in room 7, his name was Patterson, Army, 22 years. A knee replacement he'd needed since Mosul and had spent 4 years fighting with the VA to get approved, looked out from his doorway. He had been watching the floor's dynamics, the way veterans watch things, which is quietly and completely. I met his eyes for 1 second. He gave me a small nod that meant, "I see it." I returned the smallest possible version of the same nod. "Remove the culture from the queue," Quan said. "The sample is already at the lab." He went very still. This was, I recognized, the particular stillness of a man calibrating how publicly to express something he is feeling privately. "You're on thin ice, Voss," he said. "I will have you moved off my service tonight if you can't follow basic professional protocol." "That's your call to make," I said. He made it. Sandra came to find me 20 minutes later to inform me that I was being reassigned to the overflow hall for the remainder of the shift. An area used for less acute patients. Essentially a holding area where there was nothing to do except vital sign checks every 2 hours and where I could be safely out of Quan's orbit. Patterson called from room 7 as I passed. "You do what you need to do." "I know," I said. I went to the overflow hall. I checked my vitals. I pressed my back against the wall and I waited, because I had learned a very long time ago that waiting is not the same as losing, and that the difference between those two things is often the only thing standing between a person and giving up something they shouldn't give up. And then the building vibrated. Not the HVAC, not the elevator. Something external, a resonance that came through the concrete and glass rather than through the air, the low-frequency calling card of heavy vehicle engines arriving in formation and not caring who knows it. I felt it in the soles of my feet, then in my sternum. And then through the window at the far end of the overflow hall, I saw the headlights. 4 sets, military vehicles, the profile unmistakable, moving through the parking structure approach with the specific purposeful unhaste of people who are going exactly where they intend to go. I recognized the vehicle type before I had consciously registered seeing them. Joint Light Tactical Vehicles. Not National Guard, not MPs, not the kind of military presence that comes to civilian hospitals for administrative reasons. The 75th Ranger Regiment has a particular way of putting vehicles in a parking lot that is different from every other element I've worked with or near. And I know it the way I know the sound of a pneumothorax on a stethoscope. Not because I looked it up, but because I have been in proximity to both enough times that the recognition is now reflex. I pressed myself against the wall near the linen cart. In the distance, down the main corridor, I heard commotion. Voices at the nursing station. The particular rise in register that happens when something has arrived that the civilian staff wasn't expecting and doesn't have a protocol for. I heard Sandra's voice, pitched higher than usual. I heard a male voice, even, controlled, not raising itself for the room. "No." I pressed harder into the wall. Not my unit. Not my problem. Not tonight. I heard, "We have a critical casualty. Training accident, blast overpressure, secondary blunt trauma. We need a specialist." I heard a resident say something about the trauma bay being on the floor below. I heard, "We didn't come for the trauma bay. We came for a specific person." I closed my eyes. I opened them. Then I heard Sandra say, "I don't know who you're looking for. Everyone on this floor is a floor nurse." And I heard the even voice say, "She goes by Rook." The corridor was quiet for a moment after that. Not because no one was there. It was full. I could hear it. But because the name had landed in a space that didn't know what to do with it. And the room was momentarily suspended in that confusion. I was looking at my hands. They were against the wall at hip height, flat against the painted concrete, and they were still. The particular stillness that isn't calm, so much as very old training doing what it does when the situation requires it. I heard footsteps, tactical boots on linoleum, a different weight and a different rhythm than anything else in this building. And I know that rhythm like a language. And hearing it in a place I thought I'd made safe sent something through my chest that I don't have a good name for. The footsteps stopped in the doorway of the overflow hall. I did not look up. Rook. One word. Even. Not a question. The voice of a man who has already found what he came looking for and is simply completing a formality. Nobody else in the overflow hall moved or responded. There were 2 patients in the hall, both asleep. There was one other aide at the far station who looked up with the expression of someone hearing a word in a language they don't speak. I was the only person in the room who didn't look confused. I was looking at my hands. Then I looked at him. Captain Eli Torres. I knew his face from a briefing photograph I'd seen in 2016, 6 months before my separation. He'd been a first lieutenant then. He was looking at me now with the expression of someone who has spent time finding someone and is experiencing the specific feeling of having found them in a place they weren't expecting. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like a reckoning. I pushed off the wall. I did not rush. My posture did a thing it does, straightens, settles, aligns, that I haven't been able to train out of myself and have stopped trying to. I walked toward him. "Captain," I said. "Rook," he said. "We need you." "Tell me the patient." The casualty was in the second vehicle. A Ranger, 24, blast overpressure during a training breach, and then a secondary impact with a concrete support structure. Conscious, but deteriorating. The on-site medic had flagged a possible tension pneumo. I could tell from the ride description that he was right. We were in the ambulance bay. The Ranger was on a litter. His name was Caswell. His eyes were tracking, but his breathing had the quality I know, compensating for something it shouldn't have to compensate for. Slight asymmetry on the right. The chest moving the way a chest moves when the pressure inside is starting to win. I put my hands on him. They moved to the landmarks before the order arrived from my brain. Right side, intercostal margin. I listened with the stethoscope a Ranger handed me without being asked. Breath sounds diminished on the right in the specific way that has one differential in a blast casualty. "Tension pneumo," I said. "Right side, decompress now." One of the Rangers was already holding out a 14-gauge angio cath. "Move," I said. They moved. I found the second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line. I have done this in the dark, in a moving vehicle, in Logar at altitude with my headlamp failing and 2 men talking to me at once. I have done it with less, in worse. I seated the needle. The hiss of released pressure is the single most recognizable sound I know. A chest re-equalizing, a decision made correctly and on time. I'm not Rook anymore. But my hands remember every patient Rook ever had. Caswell exhaled. His next breath was fuller. The count I learned from a flight surgeon at Bagram, 60 seconds. Trust them, I counted. His numbers held. CT head and spine before you move him, I said to Torres. He was already on the radio. I stood up. My knee complained the way it always does after concrete. I straightened anyway. Sandra and Kwan had appeared at the bay entrance. Kwan had an expression I hadn't seen on him before. A man who walked into the middle of a sentence he didn't hear the beginning of. Torres turned to him. We'll need your imaging suite. Not a request. Kwan opened his mouth, closed it, looked at me. I didn't look back. Caswell's CT came back with a moderate diffuse axonal injury, survivable with proper management, and no cervical compromise. The tension pneumo had been the immediate threat, and it had been addressed, and the Ranger was going to live. And the on-site medic Greer shook my hand in the hallway outside imaging, with a particular grip that means something different than a standard handshake. Torres pulled me aside near the stairwell. How long have you been here? He said. 14 months. We looked for you after the separation. I know, I said. I wasn't ready to be found. He looked at me the way soldiers look at each other when the sentence holds more than its words. He nodded once. Sergeant Major Reeves asked about you at the last reunion, he said. Something moved in my chest. Reeves had been my element lead in Logar. He was the reason I had a call sign instead of a casualty report. Tell him I'm good, I said. Are you? I thought about room 9. Alderton's culture at the lab, the Gram stain coming back positive in a few hours, the infection I'd caught at the only moment it was catchable. Yes, I said. Torres reached into his jacket and handed me a folded document. I recognized the format before I opened it. Orders aren't always binding. Sometimes they're an invitation. No pressure, he said. The door's still open. I took it, folded it without reading it, put it in my scrub pocket. Then Torres turned to the corridor where Sandra and the resident and Dr. Gerald Kwan were standing at a radius that suggested they had been there for some time. I need to make sure your staff understands the situation, Torres said, and his voice had shifted into the register that doesn't require volume to fill a room. He opened the folder he was carrying. He read from it aloud, standing in the corridor of St. Dominic Medical Center in front of whoever was there to hear it. Sergeant Mara Voss, attached combat medic, 75th Ranger Regiment, 3rd Battalion, deployed Logar Province 2013, Kunar Province 2014, Logar Province 2015, Nangarhar Province 2016. Combat medical operations in 9 active engagements over 4 deployments. 11 confirmed lives saved in direct combat conditions. Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device 2015. Army Achievement Medal 2016. Medically separated with honorable discharge following injuries sustained in Logar Province 2017. Known by the call sign Rook. He closed the folder. He looked at Kwan. She correctly identified and treated a tension pneumothorax in a critical Ranger casualty approximately 40 minutes ago. This is the second time she saved a member of my regiment. He did not explain what the first time was. He didn't need to. Kwan had no expression available for this information. His face was doing several things in sequence, reassembling itself, discarding each arrangement, beginning again. The arrogance was still there, technically, but it had lost its structural support. Like a building that hasn't fallen yet, but has already stopped being a building. The resident was looking at me with her hand over her mouth. Sandra was looking at the floor. Patterson, the veteran from room 7, who had apparently followed the noise as far as the corridor and was standing in the hallway in his hospital gown with his IV pole and 2 tours of his own behind his eyes. looked at me from 30 feet away, and put his hand over his heart. I looked back at him. I kept my face still. Then Torres brought his hand up. Slow, precise, held. Behind him, Greer and the 3 Rangers came to attention simultaneously, and the sound of their gears settling in that movement, the subtle shift of weight and equipment, was the only sound in the corridor. Torres's salute was the kind that comes from someone who gives them when they mean them. I raised my hand. The geometry is in my arm like arithmetic, like breathing. It came up the way it always comes up, not from thought, from somewhere older than thought. The hold was 5 seconds. We dropped together. Sandra made a sound. I didn't look at her. Caswell was stabilized and transferred to the military medical facility at Fort Campbell by 0200. Before they loaded him into the vehicle, he looked at me from the litter and said, "Thank you, Sergeant." I hadn't been sergeant in 7 years. It landed in a different place than I expected. "Stay out of trouble," I said. He almost smiled. They took him. The Gram stain on Mr. Alderton's wound culture came back positive at 0300. Staphylococcus aureus, early presentation, exactly the window in which it's still straightforward to treat. The overnight resident ordered the antibiotic protocol immediately. In my notes, already on the chart, was everything she needed to make that call. I don't know what happened between Kwan and hospital administration after that night. I know that Kwan did not appear on the surgical floor for the remainder of my shift, and that Sandra was very quiet, and that the resident, her name was Dr. Anaya, and she had looked at me with something that was not pity and was not quite admiration, but was somewhere between the two and more honest than either. Stopped me at the nursing station at end of shift and said, "The culture flag. You were right." "I know," I said. She nodded like that was the correct answer. I liked her for it. I stayed until 7. I finished my charting. I checked on all my patients, and Kwan's patients, and Mr. Alderton in room 9, who was sleeping, and whose fever had already broken 1 degree with the first dose of antibiotics, which is what fevers do when you catch them early enough. I went to the storage room at the end of the corridor. The east parking lot was beginning to lighten, that early gray that comes before the actual light, the color of a sky that hasn't committed yet. The letter from Torres was still in my scrub pocket. I hadn't read it. I didn't open it now. I sat in the chair with my back against the wall, and I looked at the parking lot going gray, and I thought about Logar Province and about Caswell, and about Reeves, who had asked about me at a reunion, and about the fact that the things you leave behind do not always leave you back, and about whether that is a problem or simply a true thing that you learn to carry. Then I got up. There was a supply cart in the hallway that someone had left improperly stocked, a thing that bothers me in the specific way that improperly stocked supply carts have always bothered me, which is immediately and completely. I restocked it. I checked each drawer against the standard and corrected what was wrong. The day shift would arrive in 40 minutes and find everything in order. That was enough. If Mara's story stayed with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to the channel. We tell the stories of quiet heroes who never asked for recognition and never needed it. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this one reaches.